Canada likes to think of itself as polite, fair, and competent. But when you scratch beneath the surface, Canadian politics looks very different. It's slow, cautious, and often obsessed with appearances rather than results. This episode is about what Canadians do not usually say out loud, about our parties, our policies, and the way we govern ourselves. The elephant in the room today is Canadian politics. So stay with me. Welcome back to Daybreak, the podcast. We are discussing Canadian politics and their alignment with Canadian values. Have you ever thought about the names of the political parties in Canada? The Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, the New Democrats, the Green Party, and the People's Party? And wondered if they are really liberals, conservatives, Democrats, or environmentalists? These are brands, not ideologies. And Canadian voters defend brands instead of ideals. New immigrants inherit partisan stereotypes. Young voters learn labels before they learn policy. The names survive because they're useful. They simplify media coverage. A democracy that argues over labels instead of ideals is not divided, it's distracted. And this distraction helps the politicians. Right now, Canada is facing pressure from the United States, trade disputes, energy exports, and defense issues. These are real problems with real stakes. But instead of stepping up, partisan sentiment still dominates the Canadian skies. Every misstep becomes a talking point, and every policy a weapon. A member of parliament gets up and travels south to plead Canada's case without mandate, without competency, without a locus standi. And if he was a feudal lord from a third world country who was going to fix everything through personal favors. This is not politics. This is populism. And the United States notices. Predictable partisan politics weakens our hand and forces Canada into reactive positions. Parties exist to hold the government accountable. But when opposition means opposing the person and not the policy, Canada ends up paying the price. Canadian politics is polite, is cautious, but often mediocre. It celebrates identity over ideology, optics over action, and opposition over solution. But the consequences are real for housing, for healthcare, for the economy, and for Canada's standing in the world. This podcast is not about outrage. It's about honesty, about asking the question no one wants to ask, about demanding that politics serve Canada first, not parties. Because a country that argues over party labels or point scoring in the face of real crisis is not divided, it's lost. Canadian politics today often speak the language of Canadian values. You hear the word everywhere: fairness, inclusion, equality, opportunity. But more and more, it feels like those values live only in speeches and press releases, not in practice. There's a growing disconnect between what Canada claims to stand for and how power is actually exercised. And that disconnect is quietly reshaping the public trust and our sense of belonging. Canada has long described itself as a country built on fairness and equality before the law, merit, secular governance, and mutual responsibility. These were never meant to be branding slogans. These were our very foundation. Expectations that rules apply equally, that effort is rewarded, that institutions are neutral, and then the system works for people. These values were supposed to be the moral foundation of public life. But when you look closely at how Canadian politics operate today, those values are increasingly hard to recognize. Let's start with fairness. Fairness has slowly been replaced by expediency. Policy decisions today are shaped less by long term responsibility and more by short term economic pressure, electoral math, and crisis management. Governments react instead of planning. They plug gaps instead of building systems. A clear example is the way recent labor shortages were handled. When industries need workers, Canada brings in people in quickly. International students, temporary foreign workers, short term permit holders, they keep restaurants open, trucks moving, and warehouses running. But there's not a serious plan for their integration, stability, or long term contribution. These people are asked to work, to pay taxes, and to support the economy, but they are denied permanence or a political voices or even certainty about their future. Many live for years renewing temporary permits, never knowing if they will be allowed to stay. That isn't fairness. That is transactional governance. Use the labor, delay the responsibility. Not Canadian. Equality before the law is another value. Canadians are deeply attached to it, at least in theory. The idea that everyone is subject to the same rules, the same standards, and the same consequences, regardless of background or belief. But as George Orwell writes in his Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And in Canada, equality increasingly feels conditional and depends on political pressure, public sensitivity, or media optics. When accountability feels selective, trust collapses. A society cannot survive on equality as an ideal while practicing discretion as a norm. Then there is merit, another cornerstone of Canadian promise. Canada promotes itself globally as a land of opportunity, a country that welcomes talent, rewards skill, and values hard work. But once people arrive, many discover a very different reality. Highly trained professionals, doctors, engineers, nurses, scientists, spend years trapped below their qualifications. This isn't rare, this is systemic. It's a slow credential recognition and institutional inertia. Skills are wasted, productivity is lost, and people become disillusioned. This isn't just inefficient, it is demoralizing as well. A system that repeatedly wastes talent cannot credibly claim to value merit, no matter how often it uses the word. And then there is secularism, one of the quiet pillars of Canadian public life. Secularism does not mean hostility towards religion. It means neutrality. It means the state governs on the basis of shared civic rules, not personal belief system. It ensures that public institutions belongs to everyone equally. Yet, Canadian politics have become increasingly comfortable engaging with identity blocks, religious intermediaries, and community gatekeepers. Not to empower individuals, but to manage populations. Votes are quoted through symbolic gestures. Concerns are filtered through group representatives rather than addressed to citizens directly. This is not inclusion, it's political outsourcing. And over time, this approach fractures the civic space. People are encouraged to see themselves primarily as members of culture or religious groups, rather than as equal participants in a shared political project. Citizenship becomes a symbolic rather than substantive. Belonging becomes conditional, and the public sphere loses neutrality. Perhaps the most damaging consequence of all of this is the erosion of social trust. Trust is the invisible infrastructure of a functioning society. It is what allows people to accept compromise, to tolerate differences, and to believe that sacrifices are shared fairly. But trust cannot survive on slogans. It requires honesty about limits, about trade offs, and about consequences. Instead, Canadian politics increasingly relies on moral messaging and performative consensus. Difficult conversations are avoided, and legitimate concerns are reframed as intolerance and politically incorrect. Structural problems are personalized or dismissed. When people feel they are being managed rather than engaged, guided rather than informed, cynicism sets in. Institutions begin to feel hollow. Participation becomes shallow, and frustration looks for outlets elsewhere. What emerges is a quiet but profound alienation. This disconnect between narrative and reality becomes impossible to ignore. This gap between values and practice does not just affect individuals, it reshapes the entire political culture. When fairness feels absent, people stop believing in collective responsibility. When equality feels selective, resentment grows. When merit feels meaningless, ambition collapses. When secularism feels negotiable, the civic space fragments. And when trust erodes, democracy itself weakens. But it's important to be clear about something. Canadian values have not disappeared. People still believe in fairness. They still care about equality. They still want a system that rewards effort and treats people with dignity. What has changed is the political practice has drifted away from these principles quietly but consistently. And that drift matters. A country can survive economic hardship, it can survive disagreements, it can survive diversity, but it cannot survive indefinitely when the gap between what it claims to stand for and how it governs becomes too wide. If Canadian politics wants legitimacy again, it cannot rely on branding, symbolism, or moral posturing. It must realign with the values it invokes so often, not just in speeches, but in policy design, in institutional behaviors, and in accountability. Fairness has to be visible. Equality has to be consistent. Merit has to be rewarded. Secularism has to be defended. And trust has to be rebuilt through honesty, not through messaging. Until that happens, the sense that Canadian politics no longer reflect Canadian values will continue to grow quietly, steadily, and dangerously. Thank you.